Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. We're so happy to be here at the Commonwealth Club of California. I'm thrilled to be here with my friend Ryan Hampton to do, I think, what is the introductory launch event of his wonderful new book, Unsettled: How the Purdue Pharma Bankruptcy Failed the Victims of the American Overdose Crisis. So Ryan and I have been sort of circling around each other in the opioid space since my book Dopesick came out in 2018. I've been following his work. We talk a lot, and he's been just a wonderful friend and resource to me. So how this is going to go today is I'll be asking Ryan questions. Hopefully we can have a bit of a dialogue. In about 40 minutes, we will have time to answer your questions. And so if you want to just feel free at any point you have a question to just pop it up into the text chat, that'd be great. So in September 2019, Purdue Pharma, the maker of OxyContin, a company controlled by the infamous billionaire Sackler family, filed for bankruptcy to protect itself from 2,600 lawsuits for its role in fueling the US overdose crisis. Author and activist Ryan Hampton served as co-chair of the official creditors committee that acted as a watchdog during the process, one of only 4 victims appointed among representatives of big insurance companies, hospitals, and pharmacies. He entered the case believing that exposing the Sacklers and mobilizing against Purdue would be enough to right the scales of justice. But he soon learned that behind closed doors, justice had plenty of internal competition, and it came with a hefty price tag. Unsettled it's a riveting story. First of all, it's very accessible. It takes a lot of the headlines that you'll read about the bankruptcy in newspapers, which I find to be kind of opaque and hard to understand, and it really breaks it down into common sense language but also Ryan is so good at weaving in his personal story as well. In a way that I think is brilliant. It is the inside story of Purdue's excruciating Chapter 11 bankruptcy, the company's eventual restructuring, and the Sackler family's exit from any true accountability. It's also the untold story of how a group of determined, ordinary people tried to see justice done against the odds and in the face of brutal opposition from powerful institutions and even our government. So I'm just going to begin, Ryan, with asking how you came to serve on this powerful committee. It's got kind of a wonky title, the Unsecured Creditors Committee. But so basically, what qualified you to get the spot on, I think it was 9 members, competing with over 70 lobbyists, corporate creditors, and other big money special interests that thought they were deserving a seat at the table in order to divvy up the spoils of Purdue?
Sure. Well, thanks, Beth. I'm thrilled to be able to do this launch event with you. Big fan of your work also, and congratulations on Dopesick, coming out next week. Really excited to be watching that. I think it's great timing, given where we're at with the case. What qualified me to serve on the committee first and foremost is I wrote the book, and I'm an activist and advocate in the space, and but I'm also in recovery, right? So I was a victim of Purdue's product. It started for me in 2003. After an injury, I got caught up in the Florida pill mills, was prescribed OxyContin, was also prescribed other Purdue products for pain relief. I write about them, Dilaudid being the main one that it started with. I write about it in the book. And that led to, overdose, destruction at home, unemployment, homelessness. all, eventually heroin, IV heroin use, and got sober in 2015. And after that, started just losing a lot of friends of mine, and eventually found my way into advocacy, into activism. And one of my main targets has been for a long time Purdue Pharma. Back in 2018, Cheryl Jouer, who I write about a lot in Unsettled, and is a dear friend of mine who still serves on the Unsecured Creditors Committee. We held the largest protest, I guess you could say, in front of Purdue Pharma, and delivered a letter to Craig Landau demanding immediate reparations for people who were harmed, and money for communities that had been devastated by Purdue's crimes. Over 500 people that showed up. And when Purdue, and I had written about Purdue, I wrote about them in my first book, An American Fix, and wrote a lot of op-eds. And when Raymond Sackler died, was pretty loud about it. When they decided to file for bankruptcy, as I kind of had learned to do, I wanted to learn more about the process. And I had already been talking to other lawyers and attorneys about a possible kind of large civil action against the company and the family, and literally stumbled on this thing called the Unsecured Creditors Committee. Had no idea what it was, had no idea how bankruptcy worked. All I heard was what many people in the media heard, which was Purdue was going to be going out of business. They were going to be facing, this litigation and the bankruptcy. All these state attorneys general were going to be participating in it. And there was this kind of unknown committee that would serve as a sort of mega plaintiff in the bankruptcy, because really there is no plaintiff. It's not really the same thing as a trial. You could imagine Purdue as like the defendant of a sense, and then the UCC as a plaintiff. They have broad powers, subpoena powers, depositions, discovery, consultants, lawyers, to really get to the bottom of how much money did this company have? What did they do that caused so much harm, right? And well, there goes the Zoom stuff. What did they do that caused so much harm? And what would the ultimate settlement be? And I applied and ended up, being invited to New York City to meet with the Department of Justice and the United States trustee to interview for this position. 9 people were seated. They ended up seating 4 victims, Cheryl being one of them, and myself being one of them. And I thought at that moment, oh my gosh, we have a seat at the table, right? We're like this big band of, people who hate Purdue, can't stand the Sacklers. We're going to hold them accountable, and we're going to do this together. I had no idea what I was in for. I had not a clue. I really believed to my core that we were going to be able to do some good and deliver some shred of justice for communities. But what I learned in the process, it was nothing short of maddening. And if you didn't live it, which is one of the reasons I wrote about it, and if I wasn't there and saw it with my own eyes, it's almost unbelievable. Almost unbelievable.
What was a typical day like? Because I remember being really shocked at how all-consuming it was the first time we spoke.
Yeah, it was all day for the first several months of the case. I mean, it really depended. The corporate creditors, so you've got to know the makeup of the committee, right? So it was the 4 victims, and then it was 5 corporate creditors, which included, by the way, CVS, who's facing litigation right now in the multi-district litigation for their role in the overdose crisis.
As if they are victims, to be clear.
Right. Well, and that's the interesting part of the makeup of the other 5. Blue Cross Blue Shield, right, was representing insurance companies. Blue Cross Blue Shield denied me insurance more times than once when I needed help for my opioid use disorder, right? And they had a their claim was several $100 billion against the company that they had been harmed. Hospitals had claims represented by West Boca Medical Center. Now I'm from Florida, funny story. I actually had been kicked off the steps of West Boca Medical Center and not given treatment or help or what I needed. So you had these big corporate giants that were sitting there, and then you had these 4 victims. The big corporate giants, they had paid lawyers that it almost felt like they did this for a living, right? Like they knew the bankruptcy process. And they participated in calls, but the victims, right? The four of us, I mean, we were everywhere, right? We were on every call, asked every
Wow.
question, every deposition, went through every, file, piece of material we get our hands on. A lot of the first, several months was just getting an education, right? Because I can remember in the first 6 weeks of the case, we would have daily phone calls that would last forever. And they'd be using all this legal terminology. And I eventually just stopped them. I was like, we don't do this for a living. You're going to have to slow down and really explain to us what's happening here, because it seems like it's pretty important and it's going to impact us. So I would say that for the victims, it was more work than it was for the lawyers. And
I'm sure. And you already had a policy background. I mean, you
right?
know more about the opioid crisis than about all different aspects of it than just about anyone I know.
Which was,
and yet,
that was one of the challenges for them, because they were viewing this through the lens of bankruptcy law, which again is not criminal law. It's a very specialized version of, like, you put it on the civil side, but even civil lawyers aren't really good in bankruptcy. And then you mix it with like public health and it's like a disaster, right? Because the goal of the bankruptcy is to, preserve as much money as possible to pay off these creditors, not necessarily to institute sound public health and actually help the people who were harmed the most. Like, by the time we went into bankruptcy, people see there's this big misconception, is that the Sacklers and Purdue, really drove home the settlement that's at hand and how the abatement dollars go down and how much money the victims are getting. Nothing could be further from the truth. The Sackler, by the time they entered bankruptcy, Purdue and the Sacklers were pretty much just kind of writing the checks. The bankruptcy system created this dynamic where victims had to fight other creditors. And when I say other creditors, I mean the hospitals, the pharmacies, the state attorneys general, the federal government, to make claim that we had been harmed more than them. And ultimately, as I think is memorialized in the plan of confirmation, we lost that battle.
Yeah. So give us a sense of how you made the decision to write the book. Was there a moment when you're like, oh my goodness, I can't believe this, I got to do this? And certainly we know there were confidentiality orders in place with this settlement. Are you afraid that you've broken any of those confidentiality agreements? Having a tough time with that word today. Or was anyone actively trying to keep you from telling the story? I just want to know, like, what those agreements wedded you to, and once you made the decision, like, what was that like? Was it scary? Were you intimidated? What was the weird place of that?
Yeah, I mean, writing the book was one of the more terrifying experiences of my life. I'll also say, like, when I made the decision to write it, like, I'm not making anything from this. All the profits from the book are going to a nonprofit organization in Marlborough, Massachusetts, Team Sharing, that works with families who've lost loved ones to overdoses. It just didn't feel like the right project, to take a gain from. I really wanted to just write this to get the story out, and made that decision, last spring. I'll tell you though, like, the book that I set out to write is not the book that I ended up completing, right? So if you read the book, it takes you, I wrote it in real time. So I set out to actually write, the original title of the book was Sacked, right? I was originally writing a story which predates the bankruptcy, right? That was going to be about the Sackler family, right? From an activist advocate perspective, the Sackler family in Purdue. It wasn't going to be this story about what happened in the bankruptcy. And I was about a third of the way through the book last spring when the narrative completely changed. The lawyers actually in the case, and I don't know if they'll cop to this these days, but knew that I was writing a book. Like, counsel for the Unsecured Creditors Committee was aware that I was writing a book. Now, they didn't know that it eventually turned to be a full kind of shine the light on the bankruptcy process. But that shifted for me right around February, March of 2020, around the emergency relief fund, right?
And what was that?
So at the beginning of the case, I thought it was a crime in itself as I started to see the bills and the invoices that were coming in that I actually had to sign, right? Because I was the co-chair of the committee in, 50 million, 60 million, dollars just keep raking up that are only going to lawyers and consultants in the case. And I thought it was a crime that money wasn't making its way to the ground. It wasn't gonna get to communities in need. It wasn't going to go to help, serve community-based supports that were fighting the overdose crisis, folks who were oftentimes left out of funding cycles through the states. And we proposed this emergency relief fund, $200 million, which would have been the largest investment in American history. I mean, we have been, struggling for dollars for a long time in harm reduction, right? Syringe exchange services, things like that, fentanyl test strips. Services for family members who lost loved ones to overdoses, peer services and coaching, recovery support services for recovery community organizations.
Would have been so helpful during the pandemic as overdoses, as have just continued to go up.
Right, absolutely. Numbers were skyrocketing. So we thought, get this money on the ground. I thought it was a done deal. I was like, this makes so much sense. Nobody's going to fight this. Like, get money on the ground, 200 million of what will eventually be a $10 billion settlement, get it to nonprofit organizations, non-governmental organizations that are falling through the gaps and having to close their doors right now, actually, as a result of the pandemic. And we proposed this and fought over it for about, 5 months, and eventually got killed. Didn't get killed by the Sacklers, didn't get killed by Purdue. It got killed by state attorneys general in unison. There's, as famously a split between mostly the Republicans and the Democrats up until recent. But when it came to money, they were all in lockstep. State attorneys general felt that if the dollars weren't going through their states, and if they weren't making the decisions on how that money was going to be spent, that nobody deserved any money. And it was at that moment that I was like, oh my gosh, like, this isn't just everybody versus Purdue. This is victims and people who are like struggling to stay afloat right now versus the whole system,
Was that about power, or?
It was about power. I think a lot of it had to do with politics too, because state attorneys general had put themselves so in the forefront, in the spotlight of this case, that claiming money that they recovered was a win and made for good headlines. But what people
possible gubernatorial elections down the road.
That's right. Every, friend of mine says, famously, he says, every attorney general wakes up in the morning and looks in the mirror and sees a governor. And we're seeing that now. Some of the attorneys general who, were some of the most outspoken in this case are going to be running for governor. It's no secret anymore. So the more headlines that they could generate around this issue, the better for them. But whose expense was that at, right? It was at the expense of, organizations doing a lot of good who don't get state funding. And most organizations that do a lot of good don't get state funding. It's very hard to get into those funding cycles. It was at the expense of victims who, without their claims, the 130,000 victims in this case, none of the state claims would even exist. So it was then that I said, the narrative of this book has now shifted. And I literally wrote it in real time, like, every day as things were happening, I was writing. Now, you ask about confidentiality. They threw us a ton of confidentiality orders in the beginning that I didn't really understand, honestly. Like, I understood I couldn't talk about the case when it was going on. I couldn't do anything, if I was fighting on behalf of victim creditors that would disrupt possibly a victim settlement at the end. And I respected that very much. But I had always intended to talk about this as soon as it was over, or as soon as I left the committee. I will tell you, up until now, the noise has been a little bit quiet. I'm almost certain that there's probably lawyers from Purdue who are watching this right now live, as well as, so, hey, Davis Polk and Aiken Gump and everybody who's joining you, you get a shout out, just like I'm going to say, hi, Mom. I'm positive that they're on right now watching this. I did get a letter from actually my former committee counsel at Aiken Gump, threatening that if I said anything in the book or said anything in the media that could undo the settlement, that I could be liable in potentially billions of dollars. And the case they made is that no longer would the settlement be the responsibility of Purdue, but that I personally could be responsible to the entire claimant body, which is probably one of the most absurd things I've ever received in my entire life.
Disgusting. You talk about a shift in perception in the book, and a lot of people just learning about the case from the news see the company and the family that ran it as the sole villains in the story. What was the moment when you realized that this was way bigger than just taking on the Sacklers and Purdue, which personally I think you really explain well in a way that helped me understand it? But when was that, and what happened?
Right. So, I had worked, a few months before I entered the bankruptcy case. I was out front in Boston courthouse, with a megaphone with Nan Golden and, a lot of our mutual friends and Cheryl and others, calling for accountability on behalf of the state of Massachusetts in their original lawsuit. And I give a lot of credit to the state of Massachusetts for getting us to where we're at. But what I didn't realize was the deeper that I got into the case and coming out of that emergency relief fund battle and then getting into the mediation on who gets what, where's the money going to go, I had to start recognizing that state attorneys general, as great as they are in front of a microphone, their client is the state. Their client is that state treasury. Their job as the chief attorney for that state is to recover as much money as possible for that state treasury. It wasn't to recover money for, the loss of two of Cheryl's sons to overdoses or other family members. And their job was to fight for dollars to prevent future harm that would be going through their states and nowhere else. And it was just this real aha moment to me that we were not necessarily on the same side. Everything following that emergency relief debacle, that whole debacle just kind of set the tone for the rest of the case. When you think about the way the settlement has been structured, 92.5% of the money is going to corporations and governments. Right? Like we hear about all the headlines, but 92.5% of it's going to corporations and governments. And there's a lot of reasons why, and I write about it in the book. And only 7.5% of it is going to family members or people who, suffered from severe substance use disorder or lost their loved ones, an average of $5,000 per family. I mean, it's a paltry sum that's criminal.
Couldn't even pay the funeral.
Couldn't even pay the funeral. Or in my case, like to give people who are watching a sense of the costs. Like the economic damage, like we hear these numbers of the trillions of dollars of economic damage of the opioid or overdose crisis to communities. But what about the economic damage to families, right? Like we understand that, yes, increased criminal justice costs, social costs, right? Costs of these hospitals and insurance companies. Great. But my mom who's watching, I mean, she could pull out, she has a file still, 7 years later, 8 years later, of all the bills, unpaid bills for so long to treatment, that total near at cash value, $500,000, easy, $500,000, right? What about those costs, right? Like nobody takes that into account. The states didn't care. They didn't care. Like the bar for individuals proving harm in this case was set so high, yet states were able to just walk in and make their claim based on all costs associated with the opioid overdose crisis. Like we victims actually had to prove Purdue is the causation of the harm.
And I know we'll get to solutions later, but real quick, could I add in a question? Like, what mechanism in there is going to make sure that the money gets to the kinds of help for the 2.6 million Americans that are still suffering from opioid use disorder and somehow, reverse this almost 90% treatment gap? Yep. That is only 10% of people in our country with OUD actually have had access to treatment in the last year. How do we get Is there anything that's coming out of this that's really going to address that?
I mean, sadly, first, I know we're talking, in Purdue, a settlement that could be between $9 to $10 billion, but let's also look at, the time that it's spread over, right? It's going to be about a 9-year span until that money's completely paid off. And the multi-district litigation, you're looking even longer than that, and then divide it by 50 states. It's really, really, in the scheme of things, not that much money to really do what we need to do to combat the overdose crisis. There's estimates that say we need closer to 20 to $30 billion a year, right? Now, back to your question about what mechanism protects to make sure that money goes to the right place, and we don't end up in another big tobacco 2.0. I've actually said, and I'll stand by this today, and Beth, you and I can jump on Zoom or maybe do it in person in 10 years, but I think that the opioid litigation will go down in history as one of the most epic, colossal public health failures ever. Only about half the states have passed legislation that will protect those dollars to be spent for prevention, treatment, recovery, but it's up to each individual state to define what that looks like, right? So
and we know so much of the money previously has gone right into abstinence-only models, which largely don't work for opioid use disorder, not to harm reduction.
But also, like, I've seen the abatement plan coming out of Purdue. Like, it's just very broad strokes. It says, you can spend dollars on this, but it doesn't say how many dollars. And in every single plan, every single version that I saw, criminal justice is a big part of it, right? So what does that mean, right? Are we going to be looking at more laws that lock people up and throw them in asylums? Like, we just don't know. But the best tool we have, which is why I do the work that I do, and one of the reasons I wrote this book, is accountability. It's advocacy. It's activism. It's really, examination of where these dollars are going, and people on the ground really holding public policymakers' feet to the floor. It was embarrassing during the bankruptcy. We had, around the emergency relief fund and talks about abatement, sitting in a room with 40 different representatives of 48 different states and the United States Department of Health and Human Services and the Southern District of New York, talking about how we should spend dollars. And I'm there citing chapter and verse from the United States Surgeon General's report and federal data. And I write about this probably for the big chunk of the middle part of the book. And they're all telling me they disagree with their own data. Like, they were saying, we appreciate you citing this data and how these dollars should be spent, but sorry, Mr. Hampton, we just don't agree with you on this. We don't think these dollars should be going out this way unless, the state of Florida has a bigger say or controls the board of directors of how the dollars get spent. Like, it was very much a power play. And you wouldn't see this happen in other kind of mass torts. I think you wouldn't see this happen in other bankruptcies. This was a very unique bankruptcy. You also have to realize we're dealing with addiction. They saw me as, an addict, right? A lot of them hated the fact that I was even there, kind of schooling them on the public health side of this. And, you could see the systemic bias and the discrimination and the prejudice, just shine through in every decision they made against people in recovery, family members, people who use drugs. It shows how far we have to come until they actually really give us a meaningful seat and really listen to us.
That's right. Stigma. I mean, it's almost a cliche now to say, to talk about stigma, but it's so true. And what I've realized, after 10 years of reporting on this myself, is that, there were things I didn't understand either, but I didn't realize I was being stigmatizing in my views. And so that's why books like this are so important, because you can really have this opportunity to educate folks. The
difference with you too, Beth, though, and I'll just, because this is like, over time as we've developed this relationship, is that you've really listened to our community and you've spent time with them, right? And you acknowledge that, right? And you've changed how you write about it, right? And you changed how you talk about it, and that stuff matters. But policymakers, listen, they had all of the knowledge, they had all of the lawyers, they had all of the money. They knew exactly what they were going to do, which was just edge us out every single step of the way.
Hmm. There's a moment in the book when you sat down face to face with David Sackler, the son of Richard Sackler, who was president of the company and behind the launch of OxyContin. To date, this is the only known meeting between a victim, adversarial activist against the family, and a member of the Sackler family. What was that like, and how did you get that meeting?
Yeah, it was almost an obsession for me. Shortly after the emergency relief fund issue. So I originally actually requested and demanded a meeting with Richard Sackler because there was all of this communication going on around how much money was the Sackler family going to put in to this settlement and where was it going to go, right? In my view, and I still share this view, was that the original number was $3 billion, was they needed to go way above $3 billion if we were going to be able to compensate for get anywhere near compensating for harm to so many victims, right? I had the view of it should be full Sackler wealth, meaning if the Sacklers are worth $10 billion, we want $10 billion, right? If you're going to walk away, because this whole conversation around the third-party releases, meaning the Sacklers would get civil immunity moving forward. Like, I know it's in the news a lot, but you have to remember, we've known about that since before the bankruptcy even started. The Sacklers had a term sheet that they negotiated with the majority of state attorneys general before going into bankruptcy, saying, we're going to get a release. It's just depending on how much money are we going to pay. So I wanted to sit face to face with him. I thought meeting with Richard would have some sort of like catharsis maybe attached to it. And maybe if he talked to a victim, heard my story, heard Kara's story, because Kara joined the meeting as well, met Kara's son who, is autistic and was born with NAS. But there might be a moment there where they'd say, you know what, I am sorry. And like, here's full well, pie in the sky. Absolutely. Well, the lawyers came back and said, there is no way that we're putting you in a room with Richard Sackler. You two will kill each other. And they offered up Jonathan Sackler. They said, but the next is you can meet with Jonathan. And as you know, Jonathan was sick with cancer. We didn't know at the time. And he died before the meeting. And eventually I ended up with David. And by this time, the pandemic had been in full swing, shut down orders across the country. And we had to do it by Zoom. And if you ever want to know what sitting across a table from like pure evil looks like, get a meeting with David Sackler. I mean, he was privileged. I believe still to this day, and I know you and I have had this conversation, and it sounds crazy, but I believe he believes that he doesn't think he's done anything wrong. We disagreed on several points. The meeting got quite heated. And then we agreed on one thing, which was that whatever the Sackler family puts in, it should go to victims. But he made very clear that that wasn't his call, that would be up to the states. And he essentially cried broke to me, saying, we don't have more than $3 billion. The family's not going to put more than $3 billion in, that they would rather fight this out in court than contribute more money to the bankruptcy. And that they were convinced that if they had to go to court and have an actual trial, that they would win. To close the loop on that, though, the more I reviewed in the case, the more evidence I saw, the more documents that I saw, the more sealed depositions that I read, they actually may have a point, because we're talking post 2007 at this point, because they couldn't be sued for anything pre 2007. And the states were kind of empowered as watchdogs after the 2007 consent judgment and dropped the ball. So I put the blame as much at states and municipalities and the government for not holding the Sacklers' feet to the fire when they had access to what they had access to and still allowed them to operate the way they did. And there's a part of the Sacklers that really are kind of gunning for a fight, and they're like, fight me. And it may explain why not one of the 50 or even the Department of Justice themselves has indicted them or has brought a criminal charge. None of them have sat before a grand jury.
That's as a follow-up, you do write about sitting face to face with Richard during his depositions, and I'm just wondering, was there anything cathartic about having that front row seat? Was there an apology offered from the family? Do you think there'll be any chance of getting a criminal indictment against any member of the Sackler family moving forward? And if not, why?
Yeah. The meeting, best way to describe it is sitting, in a room with someone and you were throwing every piece of evidence at them that is known to man. I think they could have literally, drawn a straight line between like Richard Sackler and like the death of every single 130,000 victims who filed claims. And it didn't make a difference because he knew going into this that the outcome was already set in stone. Like he knew no matter what, he wasn't going to face, any jail time. The worst thing that's going to happen to him is he may have to write a little bit of a larger check. He joked, he cracked jokes here and there during the deposition. He smirked, he smiled, he laughed. He called certain attorneys that were questioning him old friends. He was laid back in his chair. I said it the other night, and I write about it in the book. It's like the best description is like a guy who just zero F's given. He didn't care. And it was frustrating to like Cheryl and myself and others who were watching this, because it was one of the most powerless feelings you could ever have. And I would jump off those calls and be like, but okay, he's getting civil immunity. There's still he can still be charged criminally. The family can be charged criminally. And it would be explained to me that that's not going to happen. I know there's a lot of hoopla by some of these state AGs going around talking about how the settlement doesn't include a criminal release and they could still be criminally charged. But I would challenge anyone who, likes research and to kind of look at these things to go find a state where there's been a major civil settlement with a corporation or individual and where that state has turned right around and charged them criminally. It was just a tacit wink, wink, nod, nod that if, they received the civil release, they wouldn't be charged criminally. And I don't think there's I think the evidence is just clear, or else it would have been done.
And is part of it too, that once the money starts coming down, I think it's called equitable mootness.
Equitable mootness, yeah.
This because the states want that money and they want to claim that political victory. They
want to claim that political victory. I mean, it is. Look, I'm a Democrat. I'm a liberal Democrat. I am an alumnus of a Democratic administration at one point before, becoming addicted. But watching certain state attorneys general, even some of the ones right now who are in the Peel, talk about the crimes of the Sackler family and Purdue, and they actually are the only ones that have the power to press these charges. And here we are years later, and we haven't seen one. It just doesn't pass the smell test for me.
We're starting to get some questions. I think I'll ask one more and then I'll go to them. Many of the government and state representatives say the money from the settlement will be used to abate the overdose crisis. We've seen them all on TV claiming, I got it across the finish line, that it will go toward prevention, treatment, and recovery resources, all things I know you care deeply about. What's not right about that to you?
Yeah, so there's nothing wrong with it, right? But preventing future harm is way different than compensating for past harm. And this is important because the multi-district, there's a lot of news right now about what's going on in Polster's courtroom. You have to remember the pharma companies, the pharmacies, the big pharma companies, they're all settling. They're going to, if they haven't settled yet, they're going to settle. There's going to be a settlement there. But the only plaintiffs in those cases are government, plaintiffs, right? It's cities, it's municipalities, it's states. They're going to take 100% of the money. And those companies are going to get a release similar to what's happening in Purdue, so they can't be sued in the future. So individuals who were harmed by these pharmaceutical companies won't be able to sue those specific companies, right, for what's happened in the past. So now we'll skate over to Purdue for a second. Purdue Pharma, the bankruptcy, is the only mechanism that exists where individuals as a collective power have a claim against the company to get any sort of compensation from them, right? And sadly, here in the United States, and particularly in this case, justice means a paycheck, right? The only way individuals can get any dollars is out of the Purdue Pharma bankruptcy. All of the things the states say they want to do, look, they're entitled, absolutely. They've been harmed to a piece of the settlement, but they're not entitled to all of it. They're not even, in my opinion, they're not entitled to even a majority of it, because all those services I pay taxes for as an American taxpayer. You pay taxes for. People who are listening are pay taxes for. They should be providing those services to us anyway, right? But they shouldn't be saying, you know, screw the victims, right? Like, we're not going to pay them. We're not going to compensate them for the death, destruction, and everything that's happened to them, because we want to fix the future problem. Any other mass tort bankruptcy, and I've learned more about bankruptcy than I care to know, and don't ever want to, like, after this is over, hear about it anymore. But any other mass tort bankruptcy, that would never happen, right? So I give this example, and then we can move to questions. And I use the state of Massachusetts, and you and I have talked about this example, and people are like, oh, okay, that makes sense. So there's a chemical company in Boston, Massachusetts, that's knowingly poisoning the water for benefit. And all of a sudden, 130,000 Bostonians lose their lives because this company has been poisoning the water. Attorney General of Massachusetts comes in and says, hey, we're going to sue this company because of what they did. It's wrong, right? And we're going to, sue them for, $10 billion or whatever. And the company doesn't have enough money in the bank to cover the liability. They file for Chapter 11. They go into bankruptcy court. Those 130,000 people or so in Boston, Massachusetts, file a bankruptcy claim because they lost a loved one from this water that's been poisoned, right? Do you think that the state of Massachusetts in that case would stand up and say in open court, but we believe that the state should recover 92.5% of that money because we want to build a better water system for the future, but the victims that lost their lives, they
still struggling with health
still
issues.
struggling with health issues. Like, they'll be okay because we're gonna fix it for the future. I mean, that's not what happened in the Boston Marathon case. I mean, there's bankruptcy cases where there's been faulty seatbelts, right? Where people have been harmed from these seatbelts in these car companies, and they received a bruise as a result of the seatbelt, and they're getting more money than what a mother will get if she lost her son or daughter to Oxycontin, right? It goes right back to that stigma, bias, discrimination. They see us as different. They see us as not worthy. I was told during the bankruptcy and I write about it in Unsettled, the deputy AG, who said they don't believe we should get anything. The victims should get anything because we did this to ourselves, and the states were the ones providing the services. When the cameras were off, they were not shy about it. Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of families, one woman who's on here, it might be one parent who's on here says they lost their son at age 27. $1 billion couldn't bring him back. And of course, we know so many people, and they. It's almost an insult, this average $5,000 claim. But the question here is relative to the settlement cost. Has the cost for the loss of life ever been put in financial terms?
Yes. And I think that, so there was two mediators in the case, Lane Phillips and Ken Feinberg being the same one who mediated the 9/11 fund. And there had to be term sheets that were put together between the different creditor groups that were mediated under those two, chief kind of negotiators of what is the cost of a human life. And I think that was with the dollars that were presented, which at this time was $750 million before attorney's fees, by the way. So it'll probably be closer to 500 million split between 130,000 victims. But the number they landed on was about $48,000 for death, right? And then it's scaled down to $3,500. but hitting that $48,000 bar, it's like, you know, it's like hitting a sick jackpot in a sense, because the harm that you have to prove to get to that $48,000 is extraordinary, right? Not only do you need to go through a process with a claims administrator, which has yet to start, right, for people who have claims, but you have to show prescriptions that say that you were prescribed Purdue. You've got to then show records of like treatment and hospital records, and really draw this straight line that Purdue caused that harm. Now that sounds like your average listener, reader, or viewer, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. Except for many people don't have those records, and many states or pharmacies, you know, given the amount of time that's passed, don't have the records either. Like, I'm a perfect example, right? Like, I had Purdue prescriptions, I had OxyContin prescriptions, but I was in the state of Florida. State of Florida laws only require that pharmacy records be maintained for 5 years. So good luck going back and finding 12-year records from 12 years ago. And a lot of families, particularly when there was an overdose death, one of the things that I experienced was it was really reliving extraordinary trauma for them, right? Like, these lawyers and these plaintiff lawyers were really putting them through the ringer on having to go and kind of just reinvestigate their child's death. And we saw many family members kind of give up in the process, right? And just say, you know, it's not worth it. It's not worth it to me.
Like re-traumatizing for them, and you know, just
all while though, and I've got to point back out though, again, like that victim versus state dynamic, because of the outsized role of government creditors in this case, the federal government and state governments, they were allowed to essentially show up and file their claim without having to prove that those trillions of dollars, which was their original claim amount, came as a direct result of Purdue. Just using the theory, right? They use this theory that all overdose deaths in one way or another were derived from Purdue because they saw Purdue as the taproot. Now, I'm not disagreeing with that, but they didn't have to show the same proof that individuals did, right? Like, many people, like we should have been at least held to the same standard as our own government.
Right, exactly. Another question is, can anything be done at the state level in regards to the attorneys general and what they've done?
Great question. Yes. And this is why I'm a big advocate and talk about in the book, and it's called voting and asking the right questions, right? I am a firm believer of holding these attorneys general to account, showing up, go to their town hall meetings, ask them why these dollars were driven away from victims when victims should have been front and center, ask them what they're doing with these opioid abatement dollars, ask them, you know, get involved in the tracking process of how these dollars are being spent. And you know, don't allow them to politicize the issue, hold them accountable. If you're in a state that hasn't passed legislation to at least put some basic guardrails, and I know half the states have not yet, around how the dollars are being spent, then find yourselves a good state representative or an ally in the state legislature and help them write that bill. Reach out to me, tweet at me, email me. I'd be more than happy to work with you on this, because this Writing Unsettled wasn't just about getting this story out there. It was hopefully the people who read it are as outraged as I was in this process and are ready to get involved and make a difference. So this doesn't happen again, because if we don't change the system, this is going to happen again, and it's just going to be worse next time.
Yeah. Another viewer says, thank you for writing this book, Ryan. There was media coverage about how the Sackler family didn't suffer financially at all. Was that a factor in the bankruptcy case?
No. And one of the more angering facts of the case was that while their wealth, right, while their net wealth was certainly a factor in what they paid in their initial contribution, which is, you know, averaged around it's going to be somewhere around $4.4 to $4.5 billion. You know, they're worth about $11 billion. That's what we came to find towards the end of the case. this after they have paid that $4.5 billion out, which is over 9 years, and it's a couple $100 million a year. There are several models that show that the Sackler family, if they don't work another day in their life, just based on interest rates and based on current investments that they have, will actually be richer than they are today. They will recover the money that they have paid out in the settlement and end up in the net. There's some models that show that they could be worth upwards of $16 billion by the time the nine years ends. So that was not taken into account. When you really, my eyes were open because I actually looked. I wish I had the chart here. Happy to share with anybody if they reach out to me afterwards. But there's a chart that shows how their wealth goes up each year and how much they're paying each year, right? And how much they're paying each year kind of stays constant, but their wealth continues to grow. That was not a factor. And when you really look at it kind of in black and white like that, our friend Patrick Radden Keefe says it best, like that is billionaire justice. Like that is how this works in the United States of America, and it is wrong.
This is a great question, and I get this myself. Is calling the opioid epidemic a crisis of white America a fair assessment, or is it more intricate than that?
So we have more than, let's just be like dead honest, like the attention on the quote unquote opioid crisis, which is an overdose crisis. And we've had a drug crisis in this country that predates the last 10 years, gained a tremendous amount of attention when it started impacting white communities. And it was white families who were getting the attention from policymakers. And I think famously, most notably in the 2016 presidential election, which was really the first presidential cycle to see it raised to the level that it has. That being said, still in 2021, there's a massive health disparity in terms of where these dollars are going, right? Black communities of color do not receive the same resources that white communities do. Still today in summer or September, where are we? September, what month is it? October of 2021. Those communities don't receive the same resources. They don't have the same access to medication-assisted treatment. They don't have the same access to recovery supports. You see, white communities where you can do like telehealth and like take home methadone, yet in communities of color, like the only way to get methadone is to show up at 5 o'clock in the morning and get dosed, right? At some clinic that can throw you out for having like a dirty urine. I mean, and it spills over into the criminal justice system. It's important that we have that discussion and dialogue because it is still happening. And yes, that is a very true assessment, 100%. And communities of color are disproportionately impacted by overdoses. So it really doesn't make much sense. Like communities of color die at a much more rapid and higher rate than white communities do.
Yeah, and get incarcerated.
And absolutely. I mean, as a white, as a white male, I should have been arrested many times. When I was using for things that, many friends of mine did who are not white, some of them who are still serving sentences, small crimes, right? That is a direct result of my white privilege. I recognize that. Like, that is a real thing. Like, it is not colorblind when it comes to the criminal justice system today.
Yeah. So right now there are several appeals to the bankruptcy plan in play, and unsettled essentially ends after the majority of non-consenting states, led by the Massachusetts Attorney General Maura Healey, joined the Sackler settlement, essentially ensuring the confirmation of the plan that gave the Sackler family broad releases. So maybe just in the last 10 minutes, we could talk about what's going to happen next. What reforms would you propose to keep this from ever happening again?
Super important question. It is still a live ball in the Purdue bankruptcy case right now. There are active appeals from the United States trustee. There's active appeals from state of Maryland, state of Washington, specifically around the constitutionality of the non-consensual third-party releases. it's very complicated too. The issue is the $750 million that's been carved out for victims. If those appeals go through, and I asked the United States trustee this as 4 days ago, I had a conversation with them about it. I asked, what happens to the victims' money if the appeals are successful? And the answer was, we don't know. There is a very real shot, and I wrote about it in Time Magazine today, that 750 million goes from, that number to zero overnight, and government creditors take all the dollars. So it's a complicated situation. Now, should there be some sort of plan or scenario where that money could be protected, and we go after the constitutionality and the problems with the non-consensual third-party releases? I would hope so, but nobody has been able to explain that to me. That makes much sense, and I think I kind of understand, more than most the mechanics of this process. It also brings into question, like, what happens if it is appealed? Like, what happens to the Sacklers, right? And I've played this down the court as much as I can. So let's say the appeal is successful. People can go back to suing the Sacklers. Sacklers now have, billions of dollars of liability against them. What's going to happen? They're going to file for bankruptcy, right? We're going to be back into square one. It doesn't change the fact that they're not going to ever, be locked up. They're never going to face a criminal trial, right? And it also means that probably government will outsize victims once again in a Sackler bankruptcy, right? We'll probably get way less, if anything at all. So it's really very political, and a lot of unknowns. So I've really shifted my focus coming out of launching Unsettled, is how do we reform the bankruptcy process? If you would have told me 2 years ago that walking out of this experience, that like one of my main objectives for the next year or two is going to be to reform the bankruptcy laws in the United States, I'd be like, get the hell out, no way. Like, I don't know anything about bankruptcy, but what I've learned is that victims come last in bankruptcies right now of this scale, that this case impacts not just, the victims of Purdue, but the victims of Harvey Weinstein, the victims in the Boy Scout case, the victims of future cases similar to this. There is legislation that's on the table right now around non-consensual third-party releases. There is legislation addressing bankruptcy reform. Senator Warren, Senator Blumenthal, Senator Durbin, Representative Maloney. I mean, they all have kind of the outlines of what something could look like. Sadly, none of that legislation addresses, for me, the main issue at hand, which is centering victims, making sure they don't have to get in line behind the government and big corporations, billion-dollar corporations, to collect when they've been harmed more than all of them. Like, it blows my mind that none of the legislation addresses the direct harm to actual human beings. It addresses pretty much everything else, but not that. So I believe that, hopefully coming out of this, we're going to get in front of Congress. We're going to talk about this experience. We're going to make sure that victims aren't forgotten, that victims do come first, and hopefully prevent this from happening again, and really exposing the truth here. I'll close on this and just say this bankruptcy, Purdue Pharma, has been touted as the most transparent process by Marshall Huebner, who I'm sure is watching right now, the chief lawyer for Purdue, Davis Polk. It's the most transparent process, bankruptcy in the history of the world. He would say in the history of the world. And then you'd hear, Attorney General Healy, Attorney General James of New York get out in front of the microphone and say, you know what, we didn't get as much money as we wanted. Victims didn't get the best settlement, but the best thing that's going to come out of this bankruptcy is information, right? It's going to be a ton of information, 30 million documents, all the depositions. The whole American public's going to know what happened here, right? Well, I'm telling you, what is today again? It's October 6th. That information has yet to drop. And the second I decided I was going to write this book and start telling my truth of what really happened in this bankruptcy, I'm hit with a letter saying either you shut up or we're going to sue you for billions of dollars. Something is not right here.
Absolutely. Just one last question. Now that your book is out, what's next for you and your advocacy?
I've never been more grateful to be done with this case. I am looking forward. There's a lot of work to be done here in my hometown, Las Vegas. People are dying. Friends of mine need help. There are, centers closing down left and right. We have power struggles within our own state around how dollars are going to be spent. I am looking forward to, at least in the foreseeable future, really spending time here close to home. Because it's been painful in the sense that I got so caught up in this bankruptcy for 2 years, and people close to me, were hurting. And I thought that we were going to make a difference in this, and we lost a lot of people this year. And so I want to get back to basics where it really matters,
Oh, and I just want to thank everybody for tuning in, and just most of my thanks to you, Ryan, for getting in there and just so being so brave about telling this and taking on this, massive topic. When you're also struggling with losing so many members of your community at the same time. And then just a reminder again that the proceeds from Unsettled are going to go to fund treatment and prevention and nonprofit groups, which we know the ones out there meeting people where they are really saving lives, and really trying to turn back the stigma that prevents people from getting the care. And I know this book will help with that issue, and hopefully we'll begin to start to close that treatment gap, which is just unconscionable. But thanks again. Appreciate everybody for tuning in. Thanks to the Commonwealth Club of California. And I hope you have a great book tour.
Thank you, Beth. And hopefully next time I see you, it'll be in person.
Yes. I don't think we've ever met in person.
We haven't. It's like you live in a box on my desktop,
We're text box.
And good luck with Hulu and Dopesick.
Thanks so much. Really, really excited about it.
Great.
Take care.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.